The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, we're talking about those who get conned and those who do the fleecing. We're speaking with Maria Konnikova about her latest book, The Confidence Game: Why We Fall for It Every Time. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Bethany Brookshire, a writer with Science News and Society for Science in the Public. This week, I'm here with Maria Konnikova, a contributing writer for The New Yorker, whose pieces have also appeared in Smithsonian, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. She's the author of the book Mastermind and the new book, The Confidence Game: Why We Fall for It Every Time. Maria, it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Bethany.
Your book talks about cons or confidence games. And in it, you talk about famous con men and women who have sold millions of dollars in fake art and performed surgery with medical degrees they didn't have. And you also talk about small cons, including things like three-card Monty and psychics. And all of these activities, though they're nefarious, are actually very diverse. What is a confidence game?
Well, the actual term confidence game has been around for a few centuries, and the first known use we have of it comes from this lovely gentleman in early 1800s New York who would walk around the streets of Manhattan and had a very fanciful request for people. So he was very dapper, kind of very well dressed, and he'd approach other likewise dapper gentlemen and say, "Have you confidence in me to lend me your watch until tomorrow?" And if you think about it, I mean, what a crazy request. He's not just because he's asking people for their watch, but the way it's phrased. I mean, have you confidence in me? So what kind of a person are you? Do you trust other people? What kind of a world do you want to live in? Is it a world where, gentlemen like us can have gentlemen's agreements? And it worked. People would give him their watches. And by the time he was caught, William Thompson had dozens upon dozens of watches in his possession. Hence the origin of the term, the confidence man, someone to whom you give your confidence. So have you confidence in me? Have you trust in me? He's not stealing. He didn't pickpocket anyone. He didn't take anyone's watch. He didn't force anyone to give him a watch. It's a simple proposition of trust, and you give him your trust because that's the kind of person you are. So that is what a confidence game is about. It's not about confidence in the sense of being confident in something. It's all about giving your confidence to someone else.
Okay, but many people give confidence to other people every day and don't lose all their money. So it's about misplaced confidence. Yes, that's absolutely right. It's about people who use their confidence. It's about people who use your confidence for their own private ends. And as you correctly say, I mean, you use the term nefarious. They often are very nefarious ends. So you give them your confidence, but it's under false pretenses, even though you don't realize it. And they will be taking that confidence and exploiting that confidence. And one of the most nefarious things is that they will do it in such a way that you won't realize your confidence has been exploited, even when people point it out to you. And that's a little bit heartbreaking in a way. That's why people often get conned multiple times, because they refuse to believe that it could happen. They refuse to believe that someone could actually take advantage of their trust in such an egregious fashion. And in your book, you talk about several stages to a real confidence game. There's a process to people running through someone else's trust. Can you run us through those stages? Because they have kind of funny names.
Oh, the vocabulary is just absolutely beautiful. And I actually stole the terms from David Moore, who was a linguist who spent multiple decades in the 20s and 30s with con artists. And he wrote this book that came out in 1940, I believe, called The Big Con, where he really delved into kind of not the psychology, but rather the vocabulary of con artists. How do they actually talk? And how does that help us, understand what they do. And so I took all of the terms from him because he had actually spent his time with the best of the best. And they are incredible. I really I really have to hand it to grifters. They know how to call stuff, for it to really show you exactly what it is. So the first stage, is something called the put up. And it's basically a good old psychological evaluation. So this is when they really not just scope out the victim, but figure out, what is it about the victim that makes her tick? What does she want? What's her motivation? What is it that really drives her vision of the world? What does she want to believe to be true? So this is really about not just finding weaknesses, but figuring out what your worldview is, what your hopes and dreams are. Because something that you have to understand about con games is that it's all about selling you the world that you already believe in, which is not the world that actually exists. And so they really drill down before they've ever met the person, before they've ever really had any interaction with them. They figure out, what is it about this person that makes her vulnerable? And so that's, in some ways, one of the most important, if not the most important steps of the game, because if you do it well, then you're very well prepared to do the rest of it. And if you don't, then no matter how persuasive you are, you won't have the right story for this particular person. So after you've kind of identified and profiled your victim, the next stage is something called the play. So nobody is going to just trust a random stranger unless you're William Thompson, who creates trust very, very quickly on the streets of Manhattan in the 1800s. So you really want to create some sort of emotional connection. You want people to trust you. You want there to be empathy. You want there to be some sort of a connection, some sort of rapport between the two of you. And actually, even if you think of Thompson, he did that very, very quickly. He dressed like the people who he approached. He spoke in their language. He approached them on their own terms. And we tend to instinctively trust people who are like us. That is a very, very quick route to empathy and to liking someone else. So he actually managed to do that in seconds, which is brilliant, and which good con artists do incredibly well. So that's the next stage. You need to get someone to identify with you, to trust you, to think of you not as a con artist, but as a great person, someone they'd like to spend time with, someone they could have a conversation with, someone who's a potential friend, if not an actual friend. So once you do that, then you can start laying out some of your scheme. So what is it exactly, that you want? And you don't actually ask for money. You don't ask for anything big right away. You just start kind of roping them in, hence the rope, where you just start telling your story. And that's, I think, all of the different elements of this come into play right away, because you already have kind of that trust, and that you really need the storytelling, the emotional foundation that will make people overlook potential gaps in logic. So when we're emotional, when we're involved in a story, we don't see logical inconsistencies. We don't see things that should be red flags. To us, we already want to believe it's true. And so we end up really kind of invested in this already from the get-go. That's why building that emotional rapport early on is so incredibly important. And, the emotion can be of many different flavors. What underlies it is a good story. So there are good stories that are positive. There are good stories that are negative. It has to be a story that appeals to you. And obviously, if you've done the first stage, the put up well, then you know which story to tell and how to tell it to get the person maximally engaged on an emotional level, so that the logic kind of falls away. And then you actually do something that people think, well, that's inconsistent. How in the world, why in the world would you do this? Because it involves you as the con artist actually taking a loss. So that's called the convincer, where you actually end up being convincing. So things are going well. So for instance, if it's a Ponzi scheme, if we're talking about, a name that I think is familiar to most everyone, Bernie Madoff, you actually get the good returns on your money. If you're Lance Armstrong, you actually, win the Tour de France, and he did it without doping originally. So you have actually good faith proof, that you're capable, and that, you're in good hands. So that by the time things start actually going wrong, which is called the breakdown, where you're literally breaking the mark down, people don't see it as a breakdown. They don't see it for what it is. Instead, they say, oh, this is just a blip. Everything is actually going just fine, because if this were a real con, then this wouldn't be happening. There wouldn't be any blips like this in a real con. I'd still be getting great returns. Everything would still be going well. And so you end up convincing yourself. And that is kind of one of the ultimate takeaways. By the time that you get to this stage in the confidence game, the con artist can just sit back and smile, because we are just conning ourselves, so that by the time that you're basically done, and these are the parts of the con that kind of start blurring together, the send, the touch, that's when you're really you're done. The con artist has taken you for all you're worth. But you don't really realize it yet. And you often don't realize it at all. So the blow off, which is the final stage, the blow off and the fix, which is basically when the con artist convinces you not to go to authorities and to kind of, to remain in the game, so to speak. A lot of people don't even need that, because first, they might not want to admit to themselves that they've been conned, because they've conned themselves so thoroughly. But the second part of it is, even if they do realize that, they often don't want their reputation to suffer. And so they end up just kind of being quiet about it. And so the con artists almost never need to revert to that final stage. It just kind of resolves in their favor, which is why, by the way, con artists often operate for decades and decades and decades without being caught.
This is really depressing. But so each of these stages relies on kind of psychological aspects of us, things that we want to believe. Why do these methods work on us so well?
I think they work for a variety of reasons, but the most fundamental of them is that, generally as a species, we want to believe in a better world. I mean, we're an incredibly hopeful species. We hope for the best. We hope that tomorrow is going to be better than today was. I mean, that's kind of what keeps us going. And we want things to work out. We want meaning. We want things to actually matter. So think about what happens if you actually go through life thinking, oh no, tomorrow's going to be pretty crappy. Today's pretty crappy. Tomorrow's probably going to be worse. The day after is probably going to be even worse. I mean, life is just terrible. That actually starts looking remarkably like a condition that unfortunately a lot of people suffer from, which is clinical depression, where you don't have any more motivation, where you say, well, what's the point then? Why am I going to go on living if life is so terrible? And it turns out that the only people who don't have this optimistic illusion, this positivity bias, this kind of hopefulness about themselves and about the world are the clinically depressed. And so you start seeing, well, on the one hand, that hopefulness makes it easier for people to con you. On the other hand, it's incredibly psychologically beneficial. I mean, it's crucial to getting us motivated, to getting us to kind of think and plan ahead. It's fundamental to who we are as human beings. And so it's a trade-off, because it enables you to get through life and to excel at life and to not get bogged down. But it also leaves you vulnerable to people who sell you that more hopeful version of the world rather than reality, because we don't see reality for what it is. I mean, if you actually saw yourself in realistic terms, you'd get very depressed very quickly.
Thanks, Maria. I feel really good about that.
You're welcome, Bethany. And you know what? Same goes for me. Nobody wants to be told the truth about themselves. I don't want people to know that, I didn't sleep well last night, so I look like crap this morning. I'd like people to say, oh, have you done something new with your hair? You look lovely. That'll make me much happier. If someone says, ooh, rough night, that's gonna be a really tough day. If someone says, Maria, you're you're just a very mediocre writer. And I would probably start crying, inside, if not on the outside. So we don't often like being told the hard truth. We like that glossy version of the world. And that's exactly what con artists feed into.
Well, so what's interesting about this to me is that, you know, we say we don't, you were saying we don't like hearing hard truths. But most of the people who are listening to this program are probably pretty smart people. Mm-hmm. And they probably think they can hear hard truths. They take criticism well. They would probably never get conned. But of you course. Maintain in your book that pretty much anyone can be conned.
Yes.
Why?
Well, because it's so funny. So one of the funniest studies that I came across had to do with explaining these illusions to people. First, you have people rank themselves on a bunch of different qualities. And normally what you see is a positivity bias, right? You're above average on everything that's good, including being a good judge of character, which is crucial to not getting conned, and your ability to spot deception and all of these things. Then you tell them, okay, there's this thing called the positivity bias, and there's this thing called the superiority illusion, and all of these, you kind of explain how it works. And then you tell them, okay, do you want to go back and redo some of your answers? And what you end up finding is that people often will go even more in the direction that they'd already gone, because they say, okay, I understand all of these biases and I totally get that they exist, but they don't apply to me. So that to me is just hilarious, because you have that bias when it comes to that bias, which just shows how strong it is. So you'll say, you know what? I totally get it. Makes perfect sense. And I'm sure that the vast majority of the population is this way, but I can hear criticism. I understand what I'm really like. I'm someone who really sees reality. And obviously, if that were true for everyone who thinks that that's true about them, this bias wouldn't exist.
Basically, what this comes down to is we get conned because fundamentally, most of us deep down believe we're better than everybody else.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. And I think the other part of it, is the exact same reason why we have organized religion, that we really look for meaning. We don't like uncertainty. We don't like ambiguity. We don't like things that happen for no reason. We like stories that explain things that make sense. And that's also what con artists give us. They give us a version of the world that makes sense rather than the messy version that we have. And to be perfectly honest, we prefer that. The messy world is not a world that, and this is all kind of the same thing in the sense that, you know, you want to believe in a world that makes sense. That's a better world to live in.
But there are some people who do get conned, and they don't get conned once or twice in their lives, or they get conned over and over and over again. They throw good money after bad. They fall for new cons every other week. Are there specific things about these people, like personality traits, or foibles, that make them exceptionally susceptible?
So there's one thing that actually does kind of predispose people to getting conned. And that's not a personality trait, so much as it is a state of life. So are you someone who's emotionally vulnerable? And this can be something that's created by circumstances. So it could be, you know, a life transition, for instance, positive or negative. You know, someone might have just died. Someone might have been born. You might have gone through a divorce. You might have just gotten married. You might have lost your job. You might have gotten a new job and kind of moved across country. What ends up happening in all of those situations is your frame of reference gets disrupted. And so when we were talking a bit earlier about kind of our need for certainty and our dislike of messiness, well, that comes to a head on those types of transitional moments. And so that's what makes a lot of people vulnerable. And unfortunately, you know, that state can persist for a while, and being conned once can actually be self-reinforcing in terms of the emotional vulnerability. And so people in those types of situations are much more likely victims. And when I said that it can be circumstance, but it doesn't need to be, there are people who, and it's also because of circumstances, but not because of one specific event, who don't have, for whatever reason, who haven't developed a strong sense of self. They don't know who they are, and they still look for external ways of figuring that out. And I learned, so I spoke when I was researching this book with some cult infiltrators. So people who actually, try to get people out of cults. And cults, if you think about it, are kind of the ultimate con. It's a spiritual con. It's kind of playing around with the most fundamental beliefs that we have about the world. And what they find is that in order to resist these cults, you have to have a very strong sense of self, a very strong center. And if you don't, you start kind of falling for those types of things. And so a lack of that sense of center, which can be lacking for a variety of different reasons, is something that can make you susceptible. And then the final reason we have repeat victims is what you and I were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, how good we are at conning ourselves. So we really can rationalize away just about anything. We hate cognitive dissonance. When we have two different things that don't actually mesh, and it's much, much easier to say, oh, I've never been conned, than to say, you know what, maybe I'm not as good a judge of character as I thought. Because you don't want to change your perception of yourself in a negative direction. So instead you say, oh, no, that wasn't a con, and you give 50 million rationalizations for why it wasn't a con. And because you've already rationalized it so incredibly thoroughly, you've primed yourself to fall for sometimes the exact same con.
This is Science for the People. We'll be back right after this. Stay tuned.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show and podcast that explores everyday life from a scientific perspective. We are a member of the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on science and critical thinking. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to support us at Patreon, to connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, and to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm here with Maria Konnikova, the author of The Confidence Game. So, Maria, you're just telling me that pretty much everyone can get conned. No one is really immune, but presumably there are ways that people can avoid being conned. There are things you can look out for. What can people do? Are there ways to train ourselves to see those red flags?
Unfortunately, not as such, in the sense that good con artists, you don't see them coming. You can't pick them out of a lineup. So here's one thing that I learned when I met with con artists. And by the way, this is the reason I stopped meeting with them. You don't meet them and you say, oh, you're a con artist. You meet them and you say, oh, you're a really nice guy. Like, you're a nice girl. Like, I like you. I sort of see where you're coming from. Yeah, you're not a bad person. I can see you're not a con artist. You had some bad breaks, and you start believing it because they are just really kind of charming, gregarious people who don't look, it's not like you suddenly meet with a sleazy salesman. That's not what con artists are. The artistry in it is making it so that you have no idea that there's anything wrong, that there's anything you should be looking out for. I mean, think of some of the greatest, or at least most famous con artists of our time that we've already talked about. Bernie Madoff, Lance Armstrong. People didn't think of them as kind of sleazy wheeling and dealing. To this day, I actually get audience members when I talk about the book who get really mad at me for lumping Lance Armstrong in with these people. And they say, no, he's a great guy. He's not a con artist. And they just go off, because he's so charming, and we really don't want to believe that he is a con artist, and we make excuses for him. So that's kind of step one of realizing that there aren't red flags in the sense that you might think of red flags like, oh, this is what a con artist looks like. But understanding that actually helps you avoid getting conned, because in a strange way, if you think that you can spot red flags, if you think you're a great judge of character in other people, then if you don't see red flags, if you like someone, you take that as proof that they're not a con artist. If, however, you understand that there are no universal signs of lying, by the way, there aren't. You cannot tell if someone is a good liar if they're lying. Anything that people have told you is just either folk wisdom or has been disproven.
What I thought you always get dudes who scratch their noses, right? I thought.
And you look up, right? If you look up, this is one of my favorite theories. If you look up and to the right, you're thinking, but if you look up and to the left, you're lying, or maybe it's the opposite. But people have these very elaborate theories, and you stutter and you turn red and, you fidget and all of these things happen. Of course. And your nose starts growing, by the way.
Mine does.
Yeah, so does mine. And it gets a little pointy. And sometimes it sprouts a few branches. But any case, so if we kind of draw a fresh start and say, okay, it's a blank slate, we can't tell. Then if you don't see red flags, it gives you permission, and not just permission, but it tells you, you know what, you should still be skeptical. What I always say is the single best approach that we can have, not just to situations, but to new people, because often con artists are people who you're just meeting for the first time, or who you've met recently and have become friends with, but not someone you've known for 20 years, although that can obviously happen as well, is that old kind of golden dictum of journalism: trust but verify. So I'm not saying that distrust everyone you meet, but I'm saying that if you trust them, that doesn't mean they're good. You still have to have some verification in place. And so that's, I think, a really good approach to trying to, and that doesn't mean you won't fall for a con at some point in your life, but it will make you less likely to fall for a lot of them if you actually go through that verification process. And if you go through it, even when things are really, really wonderful and you really don't want to verify. I mean, think about it this way. Your friend starts dating a new guy, and you see lots of red flags because you're an objective observer. By the way, this is the other thing about cons. People from the outside can often see them because they don't have the same emotional involvement, because a con artist hasn't been working them emotionally. People on the inside can't see it because they're emotionally involved. You cannot be objective about yourself. You're already subjective. You're already emotional. So your friend meets this new guy, is completely smitten. You see all these red flags. You talk to your friend and you say, hey, maybe you want to check up on some of these things, trust but verify. What does your friend tell you? Does she say, oh, Bethany, thank you for being such a good friend. You're absolutely right. Or does she say, you just don't want me to be happy. You're a killjoy. You're terrible. Like, I don't want to hear this.
Yeah, they usually say they don't want to hear this.
So that's why it's easier said than done. When you're actually happy and when things are going well, nobody wants to verify, because that old kind of saying of if it seems too good to be true, it is. We all agree with that. But when it happens to other people, objectively, we can see that that's true. But subjectively, when it's happening to us, we don't think it's too good. We actually think, I deserve this. Like, I deserve to meet this wonderful guy. You don't want me to be happy. So everything I'm saying sounds like great advice, but it's really, really difficult to follow.
It mostly sounds like, so my main takeaway from this book should be always Google your friends' Tinder dates.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, exactly. And Hinge and any new app that might come out. Yes. That's the bottom line.
So you do also talk in the book a little bit about how people become con artists. I mean, I would like to hope that most people are not really born to be con artists. But you note in the book that power corrupts and that people kind of can become con men easily. What goes on there?
Yeah. So one of the things that I really want to stress is that con artists aren't born, they are made. And it's a combination, as with all things, it's a combination of nature and nurture. So people say, oh, well, you can't you can't go down that road unless you're already rotten to the core. Well, that's not really true. So yes, there does need to be a predisposition. And I talk about some of those things. I talk about the dark triad of traits, for instance, which is psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. But con artists may or may not have them. They might have some, they might have all, they might have none, but there is some sort of a predisposition. But opportunity is absolutely crucial. So what kind of situation do you find yourself in? So I write about this guy, Ferdinand Waldo Damara, who's known as the great imposter because for decades and decades and decades, he was able to impersonate so many different people, surgeons. He founded a college. He was a professor. He almost built a bridge in Mexico. He worked as a prison warden in Texas. All of these just crazy feats. He'd never finished high school. But then if you look at his bio, was he always going to be a con artist? Well, maybe, but maybe not, because he was born quite wealthy and he had a very supportive family. Then they lost all of their money. And within that same year, his sister died in a really tragic freak accident, ice skating. She hit her head and had a hemorrhage, and he was really close with his sister. So all of a sudden you lose your status, you lose your family support. And that's when he actually committed his first con. So you can see an alternative reality where his dad doesn't go bankrupt, where his sister doesn't go ice skating, and where Damara ends up, he's incredibly intelligent, going to college, and becoming a professor for real. But once you get into that situation, once you actually go down that road, and you get away with it, most people who had the predisposition enough that they went down that road. So that's the other, let me caveat it by saying that in the exact same circumstance, if you don't have the predisposition, lots of people would never turn to con artistry. So predisposition does have to be there. But you can definitely see, an alternative reality where he's not a con artist. And once he does go down that road, he can't turn back because that becomes addictive. That predisposition actually somehow feeds on the power of knowing that you have control over other people's lives and realities, that you can create this other world and nobody knows. And that's a huge rush. And someone like Damara had plenty of opportunities to go straight, so to speak. He got lots of business opportunities. He could have made a lot of money. He never made money off his cons, which I think is a very important point. A lot of people think it's all about money. It's not. It's all about power. And sometimes people derive power from money, but sometimes they don't. And so he never took the opportunities to go straight, even though he always told himself that he would, because I think it was just too addictive, that rush of power over other people. And his was a pretty, it's a sad childhood. But then there are people who the opportunity is a little bit different. So say, you're in an organization where people look the other way if you kind of cut a corner. What if your performance isn't great? So I write about, the CFO of a company who fudged the books one quarter when the money just wasn't right, and ended up fudging it more and more and more because obviously things didn't change, and then went from fudging the books to booking private jets with the company card and all of these things. So just kind of went way down that slope because he kept getting away with it. So I think that we need to kind of look at both sets of circumstances, and then we also have to look at the self-reinforcing nature of what successful con artistry does to you.
You're listening to Science for the People. I'm here with Maria Konnikova, author of The Confidence Game. Maria, why did you decide to write a book about cons? What drew you to these people or the topic?
Well, I've actually been fascinated by them for a long time because I think that it's such an interesting process to think about the fact that oftentimes they don't commit crimes. We're totally complicit a lot of time in what happens. Not always, but we give them things. They don't take, these are not criminals who break into your house. They don't mug you. They don't, do terrible things against your will. You give them your trust willingly. And I thought that is such a fascinating phenomenon. And it had been kind of percolating in my mind for a long time. And then, very prosaically, I was watching a David Mamet film, from the 80s, House of Games, where the protagonist is someone I really identified with. It was a woman who was a psychologist, actually a clinical psychologist. So she saw patients. She'd just written a best-selling book. She was really kind of savvy about human nature. And she fell for a really intricate long con, and it did not end well, for her. And I thought, if someone like that, obviously this is a fictional movie, but how does someone like that fall? And if someone like that can fall, then it means nobody is really immune. And I found out that no one had ever really explored it. And I thought that it was really important to explore, because I wanted ultimately to give people permission to be victims, and to give people permission to come forward, and to destigmatize it, to say, look, it happens to brilliant people. It doesn't make you greedy. It doesn't make you stupid. It doesn't make you gullible. It doesn't make you any of these bad things. It's something that is just a fundamental part of human nature and could happen to anyone. And so part of my goal in writing this book was to destigmatize what it means to fall for a con.
Because there is a lot of shame. I'm recalling
Absolutely.
the incident you talked about with the professor, and I remember this. The professor at Chapel Hill, who was totally certain that this foreign bikini model wanted to marry him, and
Yes.
what she really wanted him to do was smuggle cocaine.
Well, and
to
it
this
wasn't
day,
even her.
he's a
It wasn't
laughing
even her.
stock.
Yes, he is a laughing stock. And you become a pariah because people are so judgmental. We are so supportive of victims in so many contexts, but there are some contexts where we're incredibly judgmental. Now, con artistry is not the only one, but it certainly is one of them, where we just give all of these character and value judgments right away. And we say, you know what, you deserved it. To this professor, Paul Frampton, we say, how could you have been so stupid? Of course, a bikini model isn't going to want to date you. Of course, it's someone else. Of course, there's going to be all this stuff. But of course, yeah, sure. In retrospect, when it's not happening to you. And we just always think that we know exactly what we would have done, that it would never have happened to us, and that this speaks very poorly of the person it happened to. We really talk down to victims of cons. Talk about Bernie Madoff. People were so vicious to his victims. You're like, yeah, well, you're just rich people who deserved it. No, nobody deserves to get scammed. And a lot of times these weren't rich people. These were people who were part of his congregation, who gave him all of their money. And this ruined them. They went bankrupt, and sometimes this actually led to loss of life. Con artists really devastate their victims, and we don't want to acknowledge that. We want to blame the victim because it's also incredibly convenient to do that. If we blame the victim, then we conveniently separate ourselves from the pool of possible victims. We say, oh, well, if you're greedy or you're dishonest or you're just, wealthy, know-it-all, of course you had it coming, or you're this or you're that. I'm not. So this could not happen to me. We don't want to put ourselves in the same pool, because if you say, actually, it could happen to anyone, then you're also admitting that you could be in that exact same position and you wouldn't know better. And everyone wants to think that they'd know better.
Yeah. So you actually talk to a lot of people who were conned. Including people I know, which was a little surprising. But you were talking with these people. Was it very difficult? Are people is it hard for people to talk about being conned, and how do these victims react when you talk to them?
Yeah, it is incredibly difficult. And some people are happy to talk, and they've talked about it a lot. Other people, a lot of the people I spoke with, it was the first time they'd spoken to anyone about it. And I had a lot of really tough conversations. I had multiple people break down, when they were talking to me. And by break down, I mean just someone hysterical. I had people tell me for the first time, the things that their families didn't know, like that they had attempted suicide, for instance. It was really emotionally, it was an incredibly emotionally draining project, in a way that I didn't expect. And I actually had some really tough choices to make in writing the book. I ended up not using a lot of those stories, because it would have been a very different book if I had talked about all of those kind of devastating conversations. And so I tried to find a balance where I am sympathetic to the victims and I do talk about, a lot of the pain they go through, but, it's not just about that. Even though it could have very easily been just about that, given the amount of material I did not use, where people, it's both freeing. I think a lot of people afterwards said they're really, really glad they talked to me. And after the book came out, actually, I get a lot of emails from a lot of people, which is wonderful. I'm very glad that they feel like they can actually tell me about this. So some find it very cathartic. But it's also, others don't want to use their names still because they just feel so incredibly ashamed. They feel like it shouldn't have happened. They feel like they blame themselves. Society blames them, and then they blame themselves as well.
And I did notice in the book that you kind of rely on points of view from people who had been conned and also studies on persuasion, but you actually don't really involve the direct voices of con men. And you mentioned that you stopped talking to con men. Why?
Well, because I found myself doing exactly what people like Bob Crichton, who was the biographer who wrote about Damara, did, which is you start falling for their cons and you start shifting reality to actually match what they tell you, which is not true. And so I found myself being conned by them and falling down that rabbit hole of trying to explain and rationalize what they do, which they do it so well. I mean, they convince you that they're really good people. And then if you actually just dispassionately look at the evidence, you see, wait, no, you're not a good person for this reason, this reason, this reason, and this reason. It's just very, very difficult to separate out emotion from that dispassionate appeal once you speak to them. And their voices, sure, I could have also made a very different choice and put in all of these funny conversations. And I do sometimes, there are some con artist voices who made it into the book. But I just decided that, I don't want to portray that glamorized, skewed version of reality. It's much more important for me to get the story right. So something that people don't really know about The Great Imposter, which was Crichton's book, is that it was completely rewritten. So the first draft was just flat out rejected by Random House because it was quite negative on Damara. And then he wrote this, and then he decided that the first draft was wrong anyway. And he wrote this thing which really kind of mythologized Damara in a way. Even though Damara was a terrible, terrible person, who
this is the guy who impersonated a ship's doctor in the Navy and performed surgery with like a biology book.
Exactly. I mean, this is not a good guy. This is someone who was like, maybe I'll kill you, but you know what? I kind of want to do this. Let's go. So he's not a good human being, but the book makes him into this glamorous figure. And I didn't want the same thing to happen to me. And I saw it happening. I actually ended up deleting a lot of material, when I actually reread it later, when I was no longer charmed by the person I wrote about. And I said, oh my God, how did I write this? So that's where that choice came from.
So you also went to a psychic for this book. You actually went at the beginning. You went to a psychic. How did that experience affect your views about being conned?
It was. You see why it works, because I obviously was going in for research purposes, and I didn't hide. I ended up, just being pretty honest, not in the sense that I said, hi, I'm a writer and I'm writing about you as a con artist, but in the sense that I didn't try to hide different personal facts. I just came dressed as myself just to see what would happen. And you start seeing the types of approaches that psychics use, the types of sentences and phrases they throw your way, the type of atmosphere that they create, it's really appealing. And you start almost subconsciously applying it to yourself. So a lot of these phrases, a lot of these things can apply to basically anyone, but you start personalizing it. They don't personalize it, but you do. But then you think that the insight came from them. It's this just totally fascinating process. And I could see that if you go in, with less skepticism, if you go in and you're vulnerable, I can absolutely see how people end up believing it, because it can just feel good. I actually felt really nice after leaving, because I was like, this has made me look at my career in a new light. This has made me consider all these different questions. Like it can be like a therapeutic experience. Obviously it can be a really terrible experience, and people lose hundreds of thousands of dollars and psychics wreck lives. But you can see how they reel you in with a lot of these kind of approaches that put you at ease, get you talking, and help you kind of see your life differently. One of the funniest experiences, by the way, that I've had since writing this book, is I'm obviously very negative on psychics in the book. And I come away saying that, psychics are con artists. And a lot of people, told me, I agree with you mostly. I know that psychics in general are con artists, but there are exceptions. My psychic is real.
Everyone is getting conned except for me.
Exactly. And the number of times that I've heard that, it's at this point, it's hilarious. I mean, it's very high double digits. Don't think it's quite triple digits, but I've heard it many, many, many times. And every single time I just smile. I've stopped engaging, because what am I going to say?
So most of the evidence in this book, you go through a lot of scientific evidence. It's based on psychology studies. And right now, psychology is in something of a replication crisis, in which, there's a lot of psychologists going around trying to replicate key, very supported findings and having a lot of difficulty. The effect is not as large, or they just can't replicate well-known psychological effects at all. How well supported do you think the studies you used for this book on persuasion and manipulation are?
Well, it's an impossible question to answer, to be perfectly honest. Because of course I think they're well supported. Otherwise I wouldn't have used them. And whenever I write about psychology in general, not just for this book, I always try to really do my homework in terms of looking at the whole field and seeing, how long has this existed? What is the kind of evidence we have? What's the body of evidence, rather than, there's this one cool study. And so all of the effects that I wrote about, I really tried to find things that really had a lot of support. And a lot of the replication problems are in things like priming, for instance. That's, I think, was one of the initial things that were always very kind of fragile effects. Anyone who studies priming would tell you, well, if you are aware of the prime, it doesn't work. Like, there are all of these stipulations about them. But the things that I write about, a lot of them are cognitive biases where there are no stipulations. I mean, if you look at, work of, and I don't actually write a lot about Kahneman's work in this particular book, but a lot of people are familiar with him, so let me just use him as an example. I mean, it's all just very pure cognition. This is the way we interpret evidence, and that's been, it's very easy to replicate, because you can just say, okay, this is the way that you read the finding. This is what you see, this is how you interpret it, this is how you answer this question, this is how you make this probability judgment. I mean, these are things that are incredibly robust. You can stop someone on the street and find this effect in a second by giving them a paper and pencil test. So I try to rely a lot on those types of things where you have just robust cognitive mechanisms, where we have not just an effect, but a very good explanation for why it happens. And I think it jives with a lot of things that I've learned over the years. And over the years, I don't mean like from my folk experience. I mean, during my PhD in psychology, during kind of looking at just the body of psychology literature, period. It jives with a lot of things that psychologists know about how human nature works, how our mind works. So I would feel very comfortable, for instance, saying that cognitive dissonance is not a finding that we're going to find disproven in the next 2 years. I even think that some of the things that are suffering from a so-called replication crisis might still exist. It just might be in a weaker form. We might have to say, okay, you know what, this was overblown. This only exists in this context, in this particular way, which is still great. It still means it exists, but we just have to take a step back and figure out, how robust is it, and where is it coming from, and when is it actually going to motivate human behavior?
So most of the issues behind the replication crisis are very innocent. I'm thinking about this because when we're talking about cons and fraud, most of the time when scientists can't replicate a study, there are plenty of reasons. Variables don't really translate. The sample is small. There's plenty of innocent, totally legit reasons why things fail to replicate. But there are also con men in academia.
Absolutely. And academia, this is one of the reasons I did not go into academia. And this is not just a pet peeve, but a battle that I think that everyone should be fighting about academia, and this is, I think it's actually a symptom of a broader thing that's happening to our society, but you really see it in academia with this whole mindset of publish or perish, which really is incentivizing the wrong types of research and the wrong types of behaviors. Because what I mean by wrong types of research are you have to do research that you can publish quickly. So for instance, my graduate advisor was Walter Mischel. He did the famous marshmallow studies back in the 60s, which still replicate. And his work is all longitudinal. I think he had one publication, maybe zero, when he got his first job. You couldn't take on a project like that today because no one's doing longitudinal work because you can't publish and you need the publications. And you also have, people who you basically start running all of these analyses. You start trying to do p-hacking, which nobody used to do, in the past when, you just did a simple t-test. And if it's significant, wonderful. And if it's not, okay, then I don't really have a strong effect, which, by the way, is still a great rule of thumb that I always used for my own research. But these days, the incentives are all wrong. You want to just publish if you're going to not just get tenure, but get a job anywhere. And what we were talking about earlier with predisposition and opportunity. Talk about creating an entire field where the opportunity is there. Not everyone is going to start fudging data points, obviously. People will just work really hard. Some people will just give up and say it's not for them. But the opportunity is there for everyone. That's the incentive structure. And the journals want sensationalist findings. The journals are actually perpetuating this by saying we're going to only publish you if your finding is really strong, if it's really counterintuitive, if it's this, if it's that. So if we want the best publications, then you have to kind of push it in that direction. So it's you can't blame, of course I blame researchers who commit fraud, but they didn't commit fraud in a vacuum.
And I think you have an excellent point that, the scientific community right now, it's a very high pressure environment. Are there any other careers or fields where there's that high pressure environment that kind of lends itself to the slippery slope of fraud and cons?
Well, you know what? That's why I said that this is just a microcosm of what I feel is happening in society in general. We have really revved up the kind of Protestant ethic to a degree that's really, really scary in every single walk of life. People, and we've exported it, by we, I mean the United States, we've exported it worldwide to the point where you have, places like Spain, which used to have siestas, and siestas are very good for a reason. People are not productive when it's really hot outside. There's a very good function for all of this stuff. No longer have them because you have to be productive and work, because we mistake that output for actual actually quality work. And so people stop sleeping. People start cutting all of these corners in order to show FaceTime, in order to show productivity. And it's just completely asinine, completely backwards. I mean, you could get me talking for 5 hours about this and I would not run out of things to say. That's how passionate I feel about this. But to answer your question very directly, you can see this in every single career. You see it in startups. You see it in our profession. You see it in journalism. And we do see a lot of fraud in journalism. You see it in finance. You see it in law in egregious ways, but also in small ways where you fudge a few billable hours here and there. Well, that's actually fraud. That's not cool, but people do it all the time. You see it in business settings, not just finance settings. I mean, it's just on and on and on. I think we see it in more and more walks of life, even things that you think of as, oh, well, you're very creative. I mean, one of the con artists that I talked about is a musician who felt like he had to, just jump through that extra hoop and commit fraud in order to be a truly great musician. And you know what? It worked. So we really, as a society, are reinforcing the wrong sorts of behaviors and thinking of the wrong sorts of metrics as metrics of success.
So high pressure careers and high pressure societies, they might, lead us to cut corners, but they also put us under stress, which makes us more unsure and more likely to get conned. Yep. I will admit, reading this book made me extremely paranoid. Did it change your views on cons and society?
Oh my God. I went through a period it was just terrible, after writing this book where I reread what I'd written, and I just said, oh my God, this is terrible. The world is a terrible place. Everyone is evil. I am just going to lock myself in a room, and throw away the key, which is basically what I was doing when I was writing anyway. So it's all good. I'm just not going to meet anyone new. And I just became it was very, not disappointing, but disillusioning. I felt very disillusioned in humanity. But then I've come around since then. I've realized that, these exist, bad people exist. But you know what? The whole world isn't rotten. And yes, we have this high pressure society and there are lots of things that will make people cut corners. But if you look at it, the vast majority of people don't cut corners. Even if we're in this pressure cooker, most people are still fundamentally honest. And most people are not going to steal from me. I can often, leave my laptop in a coffee shop to go to the bathroom and it's going to be there when I come back. I will not do this in some coffee shops, but, I live in Manhattan. So what do you expect? But I kind of have come around to the point of view that, to be crass about it, shit happens. And I might get conned. And I may get conned badly. And there are really crappy people out there, but there are also really good people out there. And I don't want to give up my hope in humanity just because there are bad actors. What I want to do is try to figure out, can we make society, can we limit those opportunities that make people turn to con artistry? Can we, even though the predisposition will always be there and some people will make the opportunity no matter what, can we try to change the circumstances? Because that's something we can change.
Maria, thank you so much for chatting with us about this book.
Thank you so much for having me, Bethany. This has been a real pleasure.
So The Confidence Game was fantastic. It was eye-opening, and I'm now 100% sure that every new person I meet is about to con me. Thanks for that. If you'd like to learn more about Maria and her new book, The Confidence Game, we've linked to her site and information about the book at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to Twitter, Facebook, and iTunes, where you can listen to past episodes, subscribe to the show, or leave us a review. And if you are so inclined to drop us a few dollars through Patreon, we'd love to have it. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on Science for the People.
Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Witten. Coordination and additional behind-the-scenes support comes from the enthusiastic Skeptic Network team. Our theme song was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern, and its title is Binary Consequence. Science for the People is listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount. In return, we regularly post special patron-only extra content and after-show casual conversations with guests. This show is created in partnership with the Skepchick Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skepchick at skepchick.org. The show is hosted by Rochelle Saunders and me, Desiree Schell.